July of 1884 settled over the Abilene train station, beneath a brutal sun that bleached the wooden platform boards pale and split them into thin cracks like old wounds that had never healed. The air was thick with dust, hot iron, and the sweat of bodies packed close together in the western heat, a place where every arriving train carried hope for some and despair for others. The whistle screamed long and sharp, tearing through the noon hour like a rough blade signaling the eastern train's approach. Grant McCoy stood beneath the scarce shade of the station awning, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing half a face darkened by wind grit and years spent out on open land. He was not there to wait for anyone. In truth, he no longer waited for much of anything. Past 30, Grant had learned to let things come and go like dust storms crossing the prairie loud, while they lasted, then gone, leaving dry ground, and a hollow feeling he never bothered to name. He believed he had buried the past, folded it away somewhere between hard winters and burning summers, where people lived by work and silence and had no reason to look back. The train slowed to a stop. Steam burst outward, swallowing the figures moving in. The crowd surged, boots striking wood, hurried calls, children crying beneath rushed greetings. Grant turned as he always did when trains arrived ready to leave. Then, in the churn of bodies, he saw her. Althea Rivers stepped down from the carriage with a pace that was neither rushed nor hesitant, as if she had been preparing herself for this moment for a long time. Her dark dress was worn thin from travel sleeves, neatly folded seams no longer straight, but clean and careful, the marks of a woman accustomed to tending to herself. Her black hair was pinned at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands shaken free by the heat, brushing against brown skin at her throat, where the western sun showed no mercy. In her hand was a small bag filled with essentials held tight, as though it were the last line between her and the life she had left behind. A cold space opened in Grant's chest despite the heat. 15 years. That was how long it had been since he last saw Althea, the girl who once stood by a creek in Tennessee, eyes both stubborn and gentle, daring to believe life still allowed for other choices. He had thought the memory would fade, worn down by labor, by long nights alone, by mornings that required no one waiting. But seeing her now brought it all back, not as something tender, but like an old scar pressed without warning. Their eyes met before either could speak. There was no smile, no joy people expect from reunions, only a still moment in which each saw not just the familiar face of the past, but the long road the other had walked, and all that could never be reclaimed. Althea's gaze no longer carried the clarity of youth. It held the weight of a woman who had walked through too many closed doors alone, who understood that every step forward came at a cost. Grant heard his own voice before deciding whether he should speak at all. Her name left his mouth rough and out of place amid the station noise. Althea. She stopped as if called back from somewhere distant. Her eyes wavered, then settled on him. For a brief second, Grant thought she might turn away, pretend she had not heard spare them both by remaining within the new lives already chosen for them. She did not. Althea stepped toward him, close enough for him to see the faint weariness at the corners of her eyes, far enough that a space still lay between them, not easily crossed. Grant meant to ask why she was there, to say he had never expected to see her like this. But the questions lodged in his throat. Althea spoke first, her voice low and steady, as if she had said these words to herself many times before letting them out. I have come here to be married. Each word landed heavy and clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Grant stood still, the heat around him suddenly harsher. He looked at her at eyes that had gone too far to turn back, and understood then that this reunion carried no joy. It carried only a plain truth: some people once belonged to each other, and when they meet again, all they can do is stand still, facing one another from opposite sides of a choice already made. The dirt road leaving town stretched westward, thin and winding like a hurried stitch across the dry prairie. That afternoon, the sun was no longer as fierce as it had been at the station, but it was still strong enough to lift fine dust into the air, clinging to the hem of Althea's dress, and her shoes, a quiet sign that from this moment on she had left behind the place where her name was known. The wagon rolled on at a steady pace, wooden wheels creaking in the stillness, and the man sitting across from her said nothing, save for a few brief commands directed at the horse ahead. He was her husband, a man she had agreed to on paper after only a handful of short letters, dry lines about a house in need of care and a stable life somewhere in the wide West. On the wagon he sat upright, eyes fixed forward, as if Althea's presence were simply another piece of cargo to be delivered to its proper place. A faint smell of liquor clung to him, not sharp, not drunken, but familiar and persistent, the kind that settles into a man over many years, noticeable, yet never addressed. The house appeared as the sun began to sink. It stood alone at the edge of the field, far enough from other homes, that even the wind sounded different there, hollower, emptier. The wooden roof had faded, a few boards bowed from years of rain and heat. The front door closed as if by long habit. There was no sign of welcome, but no clear hostility either. It was simply a place that existed much like the marriage Althea had just entered. The man stepped down, first opened the door, and went inside without looking back. Althea followed, carrying her single small bag, pausing for a brief moment on the step before crossing the threshold. Inside the main room was narrow and dim, the smell of old wood and cold ash from the stove mixing with the lingering trace of liquor. The furnishings were sparse, set where they had likely stood for years, functional, untouched by care or intention. This was not a home waiting for another person. It was a space long accustomed to one man living alone by his own rhythm. The first days passed in a cold order. Her husband left early and returned late, sometimes not at all. Some evenings Althea lit the fire, prepared supper, and waited as the light faded beyond the window, only to clear away a meal left untouched. No explanations were offered. No apologies followed. The silence was not violent, but it was constant and enduring, a quiet way of stating that her presence here was not desired, only required. Althea came to understand this through small details, the way he set his hat on the table and left again, the way he never asked if she was settling in, never asked what she needed, never seemed to notice that each morning she woke in a strange house with no familiar sound to hold on to. She was not beaten, she was not shouted at, but she was not seen. Her existence was like a solution applied to a problem, nothing more. On the rare afternoons when he was home, Althea stepped outside and looked toward the dirt road leading back to town, where dust lingered long after any wagon passed. It was there, in one brief moment, that she saw Grant McCoy. He rode past the old fence, his horse moving slow, his familiar shape cutting through the late afternoon light. He did not stop. He did not call out. But his eyes, as they passed, found hers standing in the yard, and for a single breath, both of them paused. There was no greeting, no gesture that crossed a line. Grant gave a slight nod, so small it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely. Althea stood still, fingers tightening around her skirt, feeling a faint shift in her chest, like the moment the wind changes direction, before one fully notices. Then Grant rode on his figure, disappearing behind the low trees, leaving the road empty and a hollow feeling without a name. That night, Althea sat alone at the wooden table, the oil lamp flickering and casting a pale yellow glow on bare walls. She did not cry. She did not ask herself where she had gone wrong. She simply sat listening to the house's silence and slowly understood that she was living a life already arranged, a place where she was not chosen, only placed where she was needed. and somewhere beyond that fence there was one man who had seen it, even though neither of them spoke. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so steady that Althea could tell the hour simply by the way the light fell across the hard ground in front of the porch. Mornings found her awake while the house was still cool, lighting the fire, tending to tasks that were already neat enough to need no extra hands. At noon, the sun stood high, the air pressed down heavy, and every movement slowed. In the afternoons, when the wind finally moved across the prairie, carrying dust and the smell of dry earth, she stepped out into the yard, as though it were the only place where she could breathe a little deeper. It was during those afternoons that Grant McCoy began to appear. Not abruptly, and never with a clear question or greeting, but through repeated passings frequent enough to stop feeling entirely random, yet spaced just enough that no one could name them as deliberate. He rode along the old fence line, sometimes pausing to inspect a loose board, sometimes offering only a brief nod, before moving on as if he were merely passing through. One afternoon, as Althea struggled to tighten a sagging wire along the western fence, Grant stopped his horse, dismounted, and came over without a word. He took hold of the other end, his rough hands bracing it firm so she could secure the knot. The gesture was so natural that Althea only registered it once the work was done, once the space between them had closed more than necessary. She stepped back half a pace, meant to thank him, then let the words fall away, sensing that anything spoken would feel out of place. After that, Grant helped repair the well, replaced a few warped boards on the porch roof. He worked quickly and cleanly, never asking questions, never commenting on the house, as if afraid that speaking even once might break the fragile balance between them. Althea stood nearby, handing him nails, steadying the ladder. Occasionally lifting her eyes to the long shadow he cast across the roof in the late sun, then turning away as soon as she realized she had been looking too long. Once, as she climbed a low step to pass him another board, her foot slipped slightly on the dry ground. Grant reacted before thinking, his hand closing around her wrist. His grip was warm and sure, holding her upright for only a brief instant, but long enough for Althea to feel his presence clearly, not as a passerby, but as something once deeply familiar returned in another form. She pulled her hand back the moment she regained balance, her heart beating faster than it should, her gaze turning aside as if to remind herself that there were lines she was not allowed to cross. Grant did not linger either. He released her, stepped back, and went on with the work as though nothing had happened. His restraint showed in every small movement, in the way he stood, slightly off to the side, in how he always kept a careful space between them, as if that space were the only thing keeping them from doing wrong. Althea understood this, and that understanding unsettled her more than anything else. She knew she was another man's wife, even if that marriage existed only in name and in long stretches of silence. She knew she had no right to let her gaze linger, to let her breathing slow whenever Grant bent to fix a board, standing close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breath. And so each time he left, she turned back into the house quicker than necessary, as if afraid she would not outrun the thoughts just beginning to form. Still, her eyes betrayed her. Each time Grant set his hat, led his horse away, and turned his back, Althea's gaze followed him one beat longer than before, slower, heavier. She stood still, one hand resting against the doorframe, feeling a familiar emptiness spread through her chest. It was no longer sharp like it had been in the beginning, but dull and persistent, like a question she was not permitted to ask out loud. There were afternoons when Grant did not appear. Althea noticed sooner than she wished noticed, in the road's unnatural quiet, in the absence of a figure pausing by the old fence. On those days she went back inside, sat at the wooden table, watched the light stretch across the floor, and told herself that this sense of waiting had no place in her life now, that it did not belong to her. But when Grant passed again the next day, offering that familiar nod, every reminder she gave herself weakened. What grew between them did not form through promises or heavy words, but through brief touches, through moments of standing too close and stepping away too quickly, through restraint held in silence. Althea never allowed herself to take another step forward, yet she could no longer return to the indifference she once knew. And in Grant's eyes, each time he rode away, there was something that matched her own slowed, weighted, and carrying far more than an accidental passing. That evening arrived no differently than the ones before, yet Althea sensed the change the moment the sun slipped fully behind the low western trees. The wind brought no familiar coolness. It stalled heavy and unmoving, holding the house in an uneasy stillness. She lit the fire, set the pot on the stove, moved through her tasks by habit, though a faint unease had already settled in her chest, telling her the night would not pass quietly. Her husband returned later than usual. The sound of the horse stopping outside was uneven, the door opening with more force than necessary. The smell of liquor reached the room before he did, sharp and biting, a warning in itself. Althea turned from the stove and saw him standing there, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused, yet carrying a different edge than before. This was no longer the familiar indifference. He did not greet her. He did not ask how her day had been. He glanced around the room and let out a short, dry laugh that made her skin prickle even before a word was spoken. His words followed, slow, broken, never raised in volume, yet cutting all the same. He spoke of her idleness, of her place, of how she was here only because of an agreement that had been signed. Nothing more. There were no crude curses, only carefully chosen sentences, meant to remind her that she had no right to expect anything beyond this quiet, diminished existence. Althea stood still, arms held close to her body, answering with a few brief words, neither defiant nor pleading. But each sentence from him caused something inside her to draw tighter, not from simple fear, but from the feeling of being stripped bare, regarded as an object worn thin but not yet ready to be discarded. When she turned to clear the dishes, a sudden movement behind her made her flinch. No further detail was needed. The way she had to brace herself against the table to stay upright was enough to show that a line had been crossed, if only for a moment. The house fell silent immediately afterward, a silence thick and pressing. Her husband sat down, exhaled sharply, and said nothing more, as though everything that needed asserting had already been done. Althea stood with her back to him, feeling her heart pound hard in her chest, not from pain but from an awakening that was rising, slow, undeniable. She understood then that this was no longer indifference she could endure, no longer emptiness that silence could fill. Outside, night had fully settled. Through the small window, the oil lamp cast a faint glow into the dark. Grant McCoy stood at a distance near the wooden fence, having stopped when he noticed the light still burning later than usual. He had no intention of listening, no thought of drawing closer. Yet the sounds that carried through the quiet night, the low voice, the sudden unnatural movement, held him in place, his hand tightening around the reins. Grant did not step forward. He knew he had no right to, and that knowledge hurt more than turning away ever could. He stood there in the darkness, watching the flicker of light behind the window. Then he saw Althea. She turned toward the glass, her face visible for only a brief moment, just long enough for their eyes to meet through the thin pane. There was no plea in her gaze, no call for rescue, only a clear recognition that both of them were facing something that could no longer be concealed. Grant saw the tension at the corner of her mouth, the way she stood straighter than before, as if holding on to the last piece of herself. Althea saw in his eyes not judgment or pity, but restrained pain, a question he was not allowed to voice. The moment passed quickly, yet it was enough for them both to understand that a crack had opened, no longer a small fracture that could be ignored. Something in Althea's life had given way, not loudly or dramatically, but with the finality of rotten wood splitting clean through after one last strain. Grant turned away first, not because he wished to leave, but because he knew that if he remained even a second longer, he would lose the boundary they were both struggling to hold. That night, when the house finally sank into complete silence, Althea sat alone by the window, the oil lamp extinguished. She did not cry. Fear and shame were still there, but beneath them an awakening continued to grow. She understood that some cracks are not meant to be repaired. They exist to force one to face what is collapsing, no matter how heavy the cost will be. After that night, the house fell into an unfamiliar quiet. It was no longer just the usual silence of an empty marriage, but a weight that hung between the wooden walls, heavy and unsettled. Althea moved more slowly through her days, not from exhaustion, but because every motion now required care, as though a single misstep might cause the ground beneath her to give way. She spoke less, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed saying had reached a place words could no longer reach. That afternoon, Grant McCoy returned, not in the manner of passing by as before, but with a clear intention to stop. He tied his horse to the wooden post in the yard and stepped onto the porch with an unhurried pace, neither rushed nor hesitant. Althea sat on the step, hands resting in her lap, looking out over the field darkening to a deep yellow under the late sun. When she heard his footsteps, she lifted her head. Their eyes met for a moment long enough for both of them to know that this time neither would turn away. Grant sat beside her, keeping just enough distance to avoid contact, but not so much that they could pretend to be strangers sharing the same shade. The afternoon wind passed over the porch, carrying the smell of dry soil and wild grass, stirring the hem of Althea's skirt. She kept her gaze forward, not turning toward him, as if looking directly at him would undo whatever fragile control she still held. They sat that way for a long while. No one spoke. This silence was no longer sharp or pressing. It settled, patient waiting. Grant was the first to break it, his voice low and slow, without trying to soften the words. "It's been a long time since I've sat still like this." Althea gave a small nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not ask him to explain. She knew what he meant. 15 years long enough for a person to learn how to live without looking back long enough for memories to become things never spoken of, yet never truly gone. Grant continued, still not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the light was steadily retreating. "When you left back then, I thought I'd missed the last train. Not a real one, but the kind that carries a person into another life." Althea drew in a deep breath, felt her chest tighten, then ease. She turned her head toward him for only a second before looking away again. The memory returned quietly, without tears or noise, just an old image, a creek bank sunlight breaking through leaves, and a young belief that courage alone could keep everything from slipping away. "I thought so too," she said softly. Her voice did not shake, only roughened slightly. "But I learned that some departures aren't made because we want them. They happen because there's no other choice left." Grant fell silent, taking the words as a truth that could not be argued. He turned to look at her, then, not with judgment or pity, but with a steady quiet, as if seeing the road she had walked, even though he had not been there. After a moment, he spoke again, very slowly, each word set down with care. "If you ever need to, if there comes a time you feel you can't stay here any longer, I can take you away." The words carried no bright promise, no reckless impulse. They stood simply as they were plain and exposed, like a door cracked open in the dark. Althea felt her heart beat harder, not from surprise, but because she had known this moment would come and that she was not ready for it. She turned to look at Grant, at a face shaped by years, changed in many ways, yet with the same eyes, deep steady. In that instant, All the longing she had kept restrained for so long rose within her, not violently, but with a quiet insistence that forced her to clasp her hands tightly just to remain seated. No, Althea said more firmly than the turmoil in her chest suggested. I can't. Grant did not ask why, but she spoke anyway, as though without the words she would not be able to hold herself upright. I'm another man's wife. Whatever that marriage is, it still exists. And if I walk away from it like that, I won't carry just gossip with me, but things I may not be strong enough to bear. She paused, drew another breath, then continued, her voice lower. I'm afraid. Afraid of the talk. Afraid of living the rest of my life as a woman who ran. Afraid that even if I went with you, I'd never escape the way people would look at me. I don't know if I have the strength to begin again. Grant listened without interrupting. When she finished, he only nodded slow and measured, as if he had expected this answer all along. He showed no disappointment and made no attempt to persuade her. That quiet acceptance cut deeper than any argument could have. They sat a while longer as the last of the light faded, leaving the sky a dull gray. Grant stood first, set his hat on his head, stepped back once. Before leaving, he turned to her and spoke softly, as though the words did not require an answer. That door. I'm not closing it. You just don't have to open it today. Althea watched as he stepped down from the porch, led his horse away, his shadow stretching along the dirt road before dissolving into the dusk. She remained seated, feeling the presence of an unseen door now standing clearly before her. It was not open, but it no longer vanished either. And in that knowledge she understood that from this moment on, restraint alone would no longer be enough to keep her life unchanged. The storm arrived late in the afternoon, without warning, like so many other things in Althea Rivers's life. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds hanging low and heavy, the wind sweeping across the fields and forcing the dry grass flat with a constant restless sound. When the first thunder rolled, the wooden house trembled slightly, as if it too hesitated before what was coming. Althea shut the windows and slid the latch into place, her hands shaking just enough to notice not from cold, but from the unease that had followed her since Grant left earlier that day, with the promise that he would not return. The rain came down hard, pounding the roof and swallowing every familiar sound. Althea lit the oil lamp and set it on the table, its pale yellow glow making the narrow room feel closer, almost stifling. She sat down, back straight, shoulders heavy, as though the entire day had gathered into a single moment. Beneath the wind and rain, she thought of her refusal of the door she had not dared to open, and of the truth that some promises are spoken not to be kept, but to test whether the heart will obey them. Hoofbeats sounded in the yard, distorted by wind and rain, but clear enough to make Althea rise at once. Her heart struck hard once, then again, before she reminded herself that this should not be happening. The knock came at the door, not hurried, only firm enough to stand apart from the thunder. She stood there a long moment, staring at the wooden door as it shuddered slightly. Then she stepped forward and unlatched it. Grant McCoy stood outside, coat soaked through rain streaming from the brim of his hat, his face darkened by cold and wind. When he looked at her, there was no hesitation in his eyes, only a quiet resolve, as if he had reached the end of restraint and found no road back. You shouldn't have come, Althea said softly, her voice nearly lost to the rain. I know, Grant answered, his voice low and steady, true to the man he was, but I couldn't stay away. Not tonight. She stepped aside without another word. Grant entered and closed the door behind him, and in that moment, the small house seemed to separate itself from the world outside, where wind and rain still raged, but could no longer reach them. Althea placed a hand on the table and turned her back, hiding the brief tremor that passed through her. Grant stood behind her close enough for her to feel the warmth of him, far enough that he did not touch her before she allowed it. He removed his hat and set it down his hand, pausing mid-air for a beat, before falling to his side. Althea turned to face him, her eyes no longer avoiding his. In the lamp's light, she saw lines that were both familiar and changed, saw weariness and resolve living together in his gaze. "I lied," Grant said plainly, "when I told you I'd stay away. I never forgot you, Althea. Not for a single day." She drew a deep breath, her chest tightening. The words did not shock her. They had lived in his eyes for a long time in those unintentional passings, but spoken aloud, they still carried enough weight that she had to brace herself against the table. "I didn't either," she said slowly and evenly, as if each word had to pass through something unseen. "But I lived as though I no longer had the right to remember, no longer had the right to hope. I woke each morning and did what needed doing, said what needed saying, and told myself it was enough. I've been numb for years, Grant. I just never named it." Grant stepped closer very carefully, as though afraid of breaking what was forming between them. He lifted his hand and stopped just short of her cheek, waiting. Althea did not step back. She closed her eyes and gave a slight nod. His hand touched her skin, warm and steady, not claiming only present, a quiet assurance that she was no longer alone. Their breathing met close enough for Althea to hear his heartbeat slow and deep. Grant leaned down his forehead, resting against hers, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was unhurried, undemanding, as though they were allowing themselves time to believe this moment was real. Althea answered, her hand resting on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and in that instant, she knew there was no way back. That night they were together not out of desire alone, but because for the first time in a long while both of them were living honestly with what they felt. The rain continued outside, the storm still roaring across the fields, but inside the small house there was a different kind of stillness, deep and full, as though every sound had finally found its place. When the storm began to ease, Althea lay quietly beside Grant, her head resting against his shoulder, listening to his steady breathing. She did not think of morning or of what waited beyond it. Tonight, the only thing that mattered was the feeling of being alive and whole without silence or fear. And she understood that whatever tomorrow might bring, the door had been opened not by recklessness, but by a truth neither of them could deny any longer. Morning light slipped into the house without haste or brightness. It was pale and thin, as if the storm from the night before still lingered in the seams of the wood. Althea woke when the wind had finally settled, leaving only the slow drip of rain from the eaves onto the hard ground outside. The room was so quiet she could hear her own breathing, steady but heavy, like a life finding its rhythm again after a night with no way back. Grant was already awake. He sat on the chair near the window, his coat folded neatly beside him, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the dew-damp field beyond the glass. There was no restlessness in his posture, no satisfaction either. He was simply there, present, unpressing a quiet steadiness. Althea watched him for a long moment before speaking. And in that moment she understood that what made this morning different was not what had happened in the night, but the clarity rising within her, clear enough to make returning impossible. She sat up, pulled the blanket closer, felt the cool morning air brush her skin. There was no hurry, no tears, only a clean kind of pain, sharp and unmixed, like recognizing a truth that had existed for years, but only now could be spoken. Althea stood crossed to the wooden table where the oil lamp had long since gone dark, and pulled out a chair. Grant turned at the sound, his gaze settling on her. He waited. He did not ask. Althea reached into the drawer and took out an old scrap of paper and a pencil worn down at the tip. She laid the paper before her, and let her hand rest on the tabletop for a brief moment, as if to be sure that what she was about to write was not a passing impulse. The words came slowly. They were not many, and they were not softened. She did not write to explain, and she did not ask forgiveness. She wrote only what had to be said, that she was leaving because she could not stay any longer, that this marriage had never been a true choice, and that she would not return. Each word was placed like a small stone. Alone they were light. Together they formed a wall solid enough that no one could pretend it had never been built. When she finished, Althea folded the paper and set it carefully on the table. She did not read it again. She knew she would not change it. This decision had not been born of the night just past. It had been forming for years, pressed upward by small collisions, long silences, and the truth that some lives cannot be repaired by enduring them longer. Grant stood and stepped closer, still keeping the distance he had always kept. He looked at the folded paper, then at Althea. There was no surprise in his eyes, and no fear. Only understanding, as if he had seen this moment taking shape long before it arrived. "You don't have to leave right away," Grant said calmly. "You can give yourself more time if you want." Althea shook her head, slight but firm. She met his gaze without wavering. "If I wait," she said, "I'll start finding reasons to stay again. And this time I don't want to do that." Grant nodded. He did not argue. He did not try to soften her words. His respect was in that acceptance, in treating her decision as something carefully chosen, not the result of a single night. He stepped outside and began readying the horse, moving slowly, as if allowing the morning to take its proper shape. Althea gathered the few things she had brought with her when she arrived. There was little to leave behind, and that more than anything showed her how many years she had lived in a life that allowed nothing to truly belong to her. When she stepped onto the porch, the sun was higher now, warming the damp ground. The house stood silent. It did not ask her to stay. Grant helped her onto the horse, the gesture familiar, but no longer cautious. He stood beside her, one hand on the reins, looking down the road that stretched away from the house. No promises were spoken. No one looked back. Their morning was not a gentle beginning, but a clean break, a point beyond which those who had seen the truth could no longer return to their old lives. As the horse began to move, Althea drew a deep breath. The pain was still there, but it was no longer shapeless. It was clear, sharp, and because of that, she knew she could carry it without being crushed. Grant walked beside her, not leading, not urging, simply there as he had promised, and as he would remain from this moment forward. They left the town while the sky was only beginning to change, not yet ready to be called morning. The dirt road still held the night's chill, soft and dark, untouched by wagon wheels, scarcely marked by footprints. Althea sat straight in the saddle, her hands resting lightly on the reins, feeling the horse's steady gait, like a borrowed rhythm to keep herself calm. Grant walked beside her, neither ahead nor behind the space between them, just enough to make words unnecessary, yet close enough that if the wind shifted, they would still hear each other breathe. The town receded slowly, like a picture being drawn out of sight, without any sudden pull. Low houses slept on windows, dark signs hanging quietly outside the saloon, not yet open, where the smell of spirits and last night's stories still lingered. There were no calls, no lamps lit in curiosity. Everything remained still, as if their departure was not loud enough to wake anyone and did not need to be. Althea did not look back. Not because she feared her resolve would soften, but because she knew exactly what she would see if she did the familiar roads. The glances that never asked questions, the words that were always left unspoken. She had gone far enough to understand that victory did not lie in proving anything to others, but in no longer having to explain to herself why she stayed. Grant did not look back either. His eyes stayed on the road ahead, where the horizon was still dim, where the early wind carried the scent of damp grass and newly turned earth. There was no triumph in him, no sense of a man reclaiming something once lost. His presence was simple, nearly invisible, a man walking beside a woman, choosing the same direction without witnesses. They passed beyond the edge of town as the light shifted from gray to pale blue. Birds had not yet begun to sing. The wind moved evenly without urgency. Althea drew in a deep breath and felt something in her chest begin to change, not lighter, but less heavy. The pain did not vanish. It merely stepped back, making room for clarity. She knew she would still think of the house she left behind, of the years lived without being named, but those thoughts no longer held her in place. There was a stretch of road where they had to slow the ground, uneven from the night's rain. Grant reached out and steadied the reins, keeping the horse sure-footed. Althea glanced down at the gesture and found no show of protection in it, only a good habit offered at the right moment. She gave a slight nod, small enough not to break the quiet around them, yet enough to acknowledge that she was not walking alone. When the sun finally rose clear, its light spread across the grasslands, and the town was far behind them now, reduced to a thin, dark line against the brightening land. Althea felt the air warm, a loose strand of hair brushing her cheek, and a simple thought surfaced without argument. This was her choice. Not to flee, and not to trade one life for a promise. Just to live without having to fold herself smaller, to fit a place that had never made room for her. Grant paused at a bend where the road widened and smoothed out. He looked at Althea without asking, simply waiting. She studied the road, then met his gaze. This time her eyes carried none of the fear of gossip, none of the guarded caution of earlier days. She nodded. Nothing more was needed. They went on side by side, their steps falling into the same rhythm. No one spoke of tomorrow, of what lay ahead, of how difficult life might become now that the choice had been made. Those questions could come later. For now, what they held was a silence they had chosen, not from lack of words, but because any words would thin what felt complete enough in this moment, the feeling of standing upright inside one's own decision. As the sunlight strengthened, their shadows stretched across the bright ground, two parallel lines that neither crossed nor pulled apart. Althea looked ahead and saw no glory, no shining destination, only a road that continued onward. And strangely, that ordinariness brought relief. No one had won. No one had lost. There were only two people leaving in silence, carrying their choice like a necessary thing, enough to live, enough to begin. Grant McCoy's ranch sat far from the main road, set back on a wide stretch of land, where the wind met no interruption from neighboring houses or fences. Nothing about it suggested a bright beginning. The low wooden house bore a roof darkened by years of sun and rain. A few old boards gave a quiet creak whenever the wind rose, and the bare yard was so open that footsteps sounded louder than usual. Yet it was that very emptiness that allowed Althea to breathe more freely. No one there expected them to become anything other than two people living. The first days passed slowly, not from a lack of work, but because everything followed the natural rhythm of two people unaccustomed to sharing space. Grant rose early, went out to check the horses, straightened sections of fence that leaned, worked as he had for years. Althea stayed inside, lit the fire, swept, set a pot on the stove, not because it was a role assigned to her, but because she needed to do something with the morning. No orders were given. No thanks were expected. They ate together, though not always in conversation. Some mornings held only the sound of spoons against bowls, the wind moving along the porch, and a silence that did not demand filling. Althea noticed this quickly. Safety here did not come from reassurance, but from not being required to speak in order to justify her place. Grant did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask if she regretted leaving. He was simply there, steady, as much a part of the place as the walls. One afternoon, when Grant carried in a few old boards to repair the eastern window, Althea stepped out to steady the ladder. They stood closer than necessary, shoulders brushing for a brief moment as he turned. No one startled. No one hurried away. That closeness carried none of the earlier tension. It was quiet and natural, as if their bodies were learning again how to exist beside another without shrinking. Small touches became more frequent, unmarked, and unnamed. A hand brushing another while pulling a rope taut, a glance meeting through the thin curl of steam when Althea stirred soup and Grant leaned in the doorway looking out. She realized she no longer had to turn her eyes away too quickly when she caught him watching. Their gazes lingered not to seek permission, but to acknowledge that the other was still there. In the evenings, they worked together on an old wooden table out on the porch. Grant held the surface steady while Althea drove the nails, her rhythm still uncertain. He corrected her only as much as needed, spoke just enough for her to continue. When the last nail was set, they stood in silence, looking at the small result. No one called it the beginning of anything. It was simply a table repaired for continued use, much like the life they were building, without promises, yet solid enough not to collapse the moment weight was placed upon it. Night settled, and firelight from the stove cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. Althea sat at the table, mending a frayed seam on her coat. Grant sat across from her, repairing a bridle, his hands practiced at work that required patience. No vows were spoken, no plans were laid out. Yet within that quiet, Althea felt something shift. She no longer held herself in a posture ready to leave. At times, Grant looked at her for a long while without hiding it, without searching. His eyes did not ask for promises. They seemed only to want understanding of the woman across from him. Althea met that gaze, and for the first time she felt no need to raise a defense. She let her eyes answer, slow and steady, as if they were both learning a new language, one in which trust did not need to be declared. This house offered no promise of lasting happiness. It made no claim that life would be easy from here on. But it gave Althea something she had lacked for too long, a place that allowed her to exist without explanation. Grant never said he would stay forever, yet each morning he rose and did what needed doing. And in that plain repetition, without display, without drama, there grew a sense of safety she had never expected to find. Standing on the porch under a spread of moonlight across the bare yard, Althea realized she was no longer counting days, no longer thinking of moving on or turning back. She was here in a house that promised nothing, but also demanded no sacrifice of self in exchange for staying. And in Grant's eyes, each time he crossed the threshold, she saw a steady presence, enough for her to believe that rebuilding, however slow, was still worth continuing. That afternoon moved slowly, sunlight spreading evenly across the open yard in front of Grant's ranch, turning the dry soil a familiar pale shade. Althea stood by the outdoor stove on the porch, stirring a pot that still gave off a thin curl of steam, her thoughts drifting through small tasks that required no effort. She had grown used to the rhythm of life here, the rhythm of work of mornings without caution of evenings, without wondering whether a door would burst open. It was that very calm that kept her from sensing danger until the sudden halt of hooves outside the gate. Grant saw it first. He lifted his head from where he was repairing a stretch of fence, his gaze darkening in an instant. The man standing there needed no introduction. The smell of liquor arrived before his voice, sharp and heavy, carrying with it the weight of a past believed to be left behind. Althea turned, her heart sinking not from vague fear, but from the understanding that some things do not disappear simply because one walks away. The man dismounted unsteadily, a half-empty bottle in his hand, eyes reddened by sun and drink. The insults came at once, without preface, aimed at Althea as if by long habit. He spoke of honor, of how she had abandoned her home, of what people would say. Grant remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, as though waiting to see what Althea would choose to do. She stepped forward. Her voice was low and clear, unshaken. She apologized not because she believed herself wrong, but because the reflex had been trained into her by years of keeping things from breaking apart. Yet the moment the apology left her mouth, Althea knew it no longer belonged to her. She looked straight at the man before her, did not look away, and said what she had long known but never allowed herself to speak. She could not go on living with a husband who was present and absent at once in a marriage sustained by silence and drink. She said it without shouting, without bitterness, simply as a truth long proven. The words halted him for a beat, then his anger flared hotter. He lunged forward, seized her wrist, pulled hard, as if to assert a power long taken for granted. Grant stepped in at that moment. He caught the man's arm, using only enough force to stop him, no rage, no display. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The wind crossed the yard, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust, as though even the land were holding its breath. Althea stood between them, aware of the grip on her wrist, not painful, but firm enough to wake something else entirely clarity. She pulled her hand free, straightened, and spoke slowly, each word set down like a stone. She and the man had never legally married. The papers had never been filed. What bound them was nothing more than a spoken arrangement and years of silence. There was no law requiring her return, no system that could name what they had as a true marriage. The words fell quietly, yet they shifted the ground beneath them. The man sneered, raised the bottle, and hurled it to the dirt. Glass shattered fragments flashing in the sun like pieces of a past that could no longer be reassembled. He spat a few more curses aimed nowhere in particular, then turned away, mounted his horse, and rode off, leaving the yard empty, but for the smell of liquor and dust. As the sound of hooves faded, Althea felt her strength drain, as if pulled from her body. She collapsed to the ground, unable to hold back any longer. Tears came hard, loud, breaking free from a place held tight for too many years. They were not only tears of the fear just past, but of the long seasons of being overlooked, used, required to exist without being acknowledged. Grant knelt beside her, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drew her against his chest. The embrace carried no distant promises, no assurance that life would now be easy. It was simply solid and warm, like firm ground where one could sit without fear of falling. Althea leaned into him and cried until her breathing steadied, until the sobs softened into quiet spaces that only silence could fill. "It's over now," Grant said softly, his voice low and certain. "From here on, you're free." Those words did not make Althea rise at once, but they placed something new inside her, not recognition granted by law or paper, but the knowledge that she had been seen as she truly was. She wiped her tears and lifted her head, her eyes still wet but no longer clouded. In that moment, standing amid sunlight and shattered glass, Althea understood that what had just happened was not a victory but a necessary ending. And from that ending, for the first time, she could move forward, standing straight, no longer needing permission to exist. That summer arrived more slowly than most. Not because the weather had changed, but because for the first time in her life, Althea was no longer counting days by the worries she had to survive. Mornings at Grant's ranch began with soft light spread across the grass, with wind moving through the low trees, and with the simple habits of two people who had learned to live side by side without needing to prove anything. Life settled into steadiness without noise. Grant rose early, as he always had, checked the horses, replaced sections of fence that needed mending. Althea stayed inside to start the fire and prepare breakfast. sometimes stepping onto the porch just to watch him work. Not out of waiting, but from the quiet comfort of knowing someone was there in the right place at the right pace. They ate together and spoke of the day's work, of weather, of the season, small talk, yet enough to fill spaces that had once stretched empty for years. Evenings passed slowly. After supper, Grant fixed tools, Althea sewed or mended, or they sat together on the porch as the sky darkened. No one spoke of the years that had been lost, yet both knew those years lived on in every careful gesture. 15 years apart, misunderstandings, trials, and long restraint had not vanished, but they no longer stood in the way. They became the ground beneath their feet, giving weight to the present. One late afternoon, as sunlight turned deep gold, Grant called Althea into the yard. He stood beside the wooden table they had once repaired together, the nail marks still visible from her first days there. He did not speak much. From his coat pocket he took out a plain ring, no shine, no fine work, just a smooth band, solid and sure. He looked at her for a long moment, before speaking, as if choosing words meant for a woman who had walked hard roads beside him. "I don't have promises to give," Grant said quietly. "Only this I stay, not from duty and not from fear of losing you, but because after everything I choose you. Every day." There was no kneeling, no flourish. Althea looked at the ring, then at him, and felt a calm, steady pull rather than a rush. She nodded without hesitation. In that moment she knew she was not entering marriage to be protected or saved, but to build together with a man who saw her whole, both the cracks and the strength. They married simply on a clear morning. No grand church, no crowd. Only a few close neighbors, an old preacher, and the yard swept clean. Althea wore a plain dress, well-fitted and unadorned. When she stepped forward, Grant looked at her with the same gaze he had carried for 15 years, the look of a man who had traveled far enough to know the worth of what stood before him. They stood side by side and spoke short vows, not of forever, but of continuing to choose one another, even when life was hard. When the preacher nodded to close the ceremony, there was no loud applause, only quiet smiles, warm eyes, and the sense that nothing more was needed to make it real. After the weddings, life did not change the way stories often promise. The ranch still demanded work. Meals still had to be cooked. Tired days still came. But one thing was different. Althea no longer faced those days alone. Grant did not speak much of being her husband, but every action placed her beside him, not behind an equal hand in the work. Not a shadow. In the evenings by the firelight, Althea sometimes thought of the road that had led her here from the dusty station long ago to a house that was never hers, to the stormy night with no retreat. She felt no regret. Every step, however painful, had carried her to this place where life was built on clear choices, not endurance. Grant rested a hand on her shoulder, a familiar gesture, never possessive. Althea leaned into him and felt a deep peace that did not feel fragile. After 15 years and countless trials, they came back together, not as young people believing love would rescue them, but as grown souls who understood that happiness is not made of grand promises, but of staying, of building one day at a time. Many years passed without needing to be counted. They moved through Grant and Althea's ranch like wind that knew the way, never disruptive leaving, only small signs of a life being kept day after day. Fences were replaced section by section, the roof was patched after each rainy season, and the paths across the bare yard deepened under the familiar steps of a family that had learned to remain not because of vows once spoken, but because of choices repeated quietly. Afternoons came slowly, not because the sun had changed its mind, but because the house had learned not to rush. Althea sat on the porch, her back against a wooden post, worn smooth by time, her hand resting on the cool railing. Before her, a small child played in the grass, short steps, laughter breaking loose and then dissolving into the wind. At times the child paused and turned toward the porch as if to be sure she was still there. Althea gave a small nod. That was enough. Grant worked out in the yard fixing a board on the horse stall. He moved more slowly than in his younger years, but his hands were still steady, his motions familiar. Each time he straightened up, his eyes went to the porch by habit, not to check, but to know the house still stood where it should. The look no longer carried the vigilance of the early years, only a calm assurance that what mattered had been kept. Their life held no loud milestones. Children came and grew up among the smell of dry grass and the sound of wind, learning to tell sunny days from rainy ones by how the air felt on their skin. Althea taught them to read at the old wooden table where afternoon light fell just right to see the first careful strokes of a pencil. Grant taught them to ride, never pushing, only holding the reins and letting time do its work. They never called it achievement. They called it living. On winter evenings when the stove burned bright, the family gathered close. Grant told stories without climaxes of roads traveled, of storms once faced, and stopped at the right moment, leaving space for listeners to understand on their own. Althea sat beside him sewing, lifting her eyes now and then, as their gazes met in a rhythm that needed no words. The children drifted to sleep, their breathing even, and the house grew so quiet, the wood could be heard settling in the warmth. Some mornings Althea rose early and stepped onto the porch while dew still clung to the grass. She looked at the ground, at fresh footprints, and remembered the road behind her, the dusty train station, the house that was never hers, the stormy night with no retreat. The memories came without sharp pain, more like a gentle reminder that things had once been different. She felt no regret. She understood that scars do not fade to be forgotten, but to show that body and heart survived. Grant came out behind her and laid a light coat across her shoulders. The gesture had not changed with the years, never showy, never possessive. Althea leaned into him, felt the familiar warmth, and thought that wholeness does not come from perfection, but from the absence of fear in what is lacking. They had built a family not from grand promises, but from the simple fact that someone came home each day. At dusk, when the fields turned a quiet honey color, the family sat again on the porch. A child rested against Althea. Grant's hand lay on her shoulder. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and wild grass, cicadas humming a steady undercurrent. No one spoke of a distant future. They did not need to. In this house, the future meant that tomorrow would still bring breakfast, work to be done, and a place to return to. If there was a legacy, it was not a wide ranch or good harvests, but a way of living passed on not through instruction, but through presence. Their children grew up within a gaze that did not abandon them, with nods instead of commands, knowing that some people stay not because they have nowhere else to go, but because they choose to. When night fell, the oil lamp cast a warm yellow light across the wooden table. Grant listened to the day's small stories. Althea cleared the dishes, familiar sounds touching the quiet. No conclusion was needed. No declaration required. Here, across the passing seasons, they had learned a simple truth: love does not need many words. It is patience, a look held long enough, an embrace strong enough, and above all, the decision to stay again and again. Perhaps for those who have lived through many seasons of wind, this story feels familiar. Each of us has known a time of duty, a long silence, a moment of wondering whether we still had the right to choose again. That is why Althea and Grant's journey is not meant to be admired from afar, but reflected upon, that at any age a person deserves a life lived without bowing their head. If this story brings to mind someone who stayed, or a decision that reshaped the years that followed, please share it with us in the comments. Don't forget to show your support and subscribe so we can continue sharing these unhurried stories for hearts that have lived a long while. We truly value every word you share,